So far, we've been rather talking in this discussion as if all organized thinking is done in language, but of course that in fact isn't so, is it? I mean, one can take all kinds of examples. In music is one that appeals to me very much. If you get a composer like Stravinsky composing a fantastically complicated and original and indeed revolutionary score like that of The Rite of Spring for an enormous orchestra, then he's cerebrating at an original and complicated and very sophisticated level, and he's probably cerebrating in as elaborate a way as anybody else is who's doing anything. And what's more, he's creating a structure which is publicly articulated and so on, and yet words don't come into this process at any point, as far as one can gather. Does that fact and other facts like it pose any threat to your theories?
Well, not really. I mean, in fact, quite the contrary. My assumption is that the mind is not a uniform system, that it's a highly differentiated system. In fact, like the body, it's essentially a system of faculties or organs, and language is simply one of them. We don't have to go to the level of Stravinsky to find examples of thinking without language. I'm sure that everyone who thinks about what he himself is doing, will know at once that much of his thinking doesn't involve language. Or say, well, the thinking of a cat, let's say, plainly doesn't involve language. There are other modes of thought. There are other faculties. And I think that the musical faculty is one which is particularly interesting, I think, because it's extremely likely. In fact, here's an area, in a sense, like physics, that is where very rapid and rich development took place in a way which was over a long period of, say, Western history, in a way which was very intelligible to others. I mean, not immediately, but after a short period. And strikingly, well, there is a striking feature of the 20th century in this respect. That is that the musical creation of the 20th century, I think, is qualitatively different from that of, say, the 18th century, in that it lacks that immediate access or short-term access that was true of the past. One would have to do an experiment to prove it, but I have no doubt that if we took a child of today, two children of today, let's say, or two groups, and taught one of them, say, Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, and taught the other one Schoenberg and post-Schoenbergian music, that there would be a very substantial difference in their capacity to comprehend it and deal with it. And that may reflect, in fact, if that's correct, it would reflect something about our innate musical capacities. Points of this nature have been discussed for some time. I remember Paul Hindemith, about 25 years ago, I think, in lectures argued that to violate the tonal principle in music would be something like an effort to violate the principle of gravitation. I take it he meant by that it was an innate property. Well, we might say an innate property.
I don't want to pursue the musical analogy too far, because I was using that really only as an illustration. What it illustrates is the fact that you think we're pre-programmed, in fact, to a whole lot of things, don't you? I mean, no doubt to use gesture or recognize faces or develop a common sense view of the world and so on.
Well, every area of human existence that's even worth studying is worth studying because rich and complex structures are developed in a uniform way. Otherwise, it's not worth studying. And those are precisely the cases where we expect to discover pre-programming that makes possible these great achievements.
So, in other words, you think that everything that we do makes manifest our pre-programming. Games, institutions, the way we dress, the way we eat, everything.
Well, here again, I think some caution is necessary. For example, take games. I'm speculating, obviously, but it seems to me reasonable to suppose that games are designed so as to be, in a sense, at the outer limits of our cognitive capacities. We don't make up games that are in which we are as skilled as we are in using words, let's say. That wouldn't be an interesting game. Everybody can do too much. What we do, we make up games like, say, chess, which is an extraordinarily simple game. That is, its rule system is utterly trivial. But nevertheless, we're not very good at it. As in the case of using language, we're all extraordinarily good, and we're essentially undifferentiable one from another. But when we get to something like chess, which I assume is at the borders of our cognitive capacity, then individuals of very similar intellectual makeup will nevertheless diverge very significantly in their ability to deal with these exotic problems. That's what makes it an interesting game. And in fact, I think there are also tasks that can be constructed that are really outside our cognitive capacities. And in fact, I think there's even a field that's devoted to developing such tasks. It's called psychology. Much of modern psychology has been concerned to discover tasks which would yield species uniform laws, that is, laws that essentially hold across a number of species, or to construct good experiments, that is, experiments that have slow learning curves with regular increments and so on and so forth. And there are such tasks, say maze running, in which rats are about as good as humans, and both are quite terrible. And these, I think, are in fact precisely tasks that do lie outside of our cognitive capacity, so we do proceed by trial and error and by induction and so on.
But centrally, your whole approach represents a rejection of the empirical tradition in philosophy, doesn't it? Because, I mean, the very fact that you think that the empiricists are wrong about how we learn must mean that they're wrong about knowledge and the nature of knowledge. And the nature of knowledge has been the central problem in the whole empirical tradition of philosophy.
Well, the classical empiricist tradition, which I think was the tradition that's represented, let's say, perhaps in its highest form by Hume, seems to me to be a tradition of extreme importance in that a particular theory of the origins of knowledge, in fact, of the science of human nature, in Hume's phrase, was put forth. An empirical theory, and I think Hume, for example, would have regarded it as an empirical theory, did regard it. So when we investigate it, I think we discover that it's just completely false. That is, that the mechanisms that he discussed are not the mechanisms by which the mind reaches states of knowledge, that the states of knowledge attained are radically different than the kinds that he discussed. For example, for Hume, the mind was, in his image, a kind of a theater in which ideas paraded across the stage. It therefore followed necessarily that we could introspect completely into the contents of our mind. If an idea is not on the stage, it's not in the mind. And the ideas may be connected and associated. In fact, he went on to say there isn't even any theater. There's just the ideas. In that respect, the image is misleading. Well, that's a theory. And in fact, it's a theory that has had an enormous grip on the imagination throughout to my knowledge, most of the history of Western thought. For example, that same image dominates the rationalist tradition as well, where it was assumed that one could exhaust the contents of the mind by careful attention. You know, you could really develop those clearer and distinct ideas and their consequences and so on. And in fact, even if you move to someone, let's say, like Freud, with his evocation of the unconscious, still I think that a careful reading suggests that he regarded the unconscious as in principle accessible. That is, we could really perceive that theater and stage and the things on it carefully if only the barriers of repression and so on could be overcome. Well, if what I've been suggesting is correct, that's radically wrong. I mean, even wrong as a point of departure. There is no reason at all that I can see for believing that the principles of mental computation that enter so intimately into our action or our interaction or our speech, to believe that those principles are at all accessible to introspection, any more than the analyzing mechanisms of our visual system, or for that matter, the nature of our liver, is accessible to introspection.
It seems to me that over and over again you come back to the same point. That is to say that many of the particular problems discussed and theories put forward by philosophers in the main, but also psychologists, and you've just mentioned Freud, and in your writings you mentioned many others, are in fact theories about physical processes. They are therefore open to checking by investigation, and when you check by investigation you find out that the theories are wrong. And therefore you are, as it were, radically subversive of a lot of very well-established theories in our tradition. It seems to me that what you put forward in their place, over and over again, in fact, does parallel the rationalist tradition. I said in my introduction to this program that what I'm always reminded of by your work is the theories of Kant. You seem to me to be almost redoing, in terms of modern linguistics, what Kant was doing. Do you accept any truth in that?